Good evening, y'all. I appreciate y'all being here with me for this much anticipated DPRK presentation. Part one is going to be covering the lead up to the Korean War. So we'll be covering periods from the late 19th century all the way up to the Korean War. In terms of this presentation, a lot of people did a lot of good work in putting this together for y'all. Special thank you to Emily with helping finalize the PowerPoint. Without further hesitation, let's jump into our DPRK presentation. We got the Korea fighting for independence, Japanese colonization and the Koreans, the Soviets and the Americans, the North and the South, Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee, and the brutality of the Korean War are subjects that will all be touched upon tonight. So we can just jump right into it. First, we're going to talk about the Korea build-up to Japanese occupation. Koreans have been forced to settle unfamiliar land so that they could be taxed for occupying that land. This creates the context for a lot of unrest in the region. You have Koreans at this time. We're talking about the late 19th century. We're talking around the 1890s. We have people rising up, we have people protesting, we have people saying, why is it that I'm being moved to land that I'm unfamiliar with, just so that some feudal lord can be able to, profit off of the Korean people. This is the kind of sentiment being kicked up at the time, mostly, of course, by the peasantry. As a result of this, Jian Bong-joon, a farmer, actually leads a peasant revolt known as the Gobu Revolt to fight against these conditions. But he's forced to flee by a person called Yi Yang-tae after the revolt is suppressed. Jian Bong-joon does end up retaking Gobu after he gathers an army in Mount Bayek. And the rebels continue their fight for the independence of Korea, and they win key battles at the Battle of Hwangtoje and the Battle of Haring River. Now, after fighting and taking control of Jeonju Fortress, known today simply as Jeonju, which is the 16th largest city in South Korea, with a population of over 650,000 today, the rebels negotiate a ceasefire treaty with the governmental forces, and they begin setting up a Jibgangso, which are institutions that ran affairs in rebel control areas. Comrade Elijah, they took what ended up being the equivalent later down the line of the 16th most populated city in South Korea. So, a very populated city. That's actually more populated than my hometown of Akron, which only has something along the lines of 200,000 people. So this is a pretty populated place, all told. Now, the government becomes increasingly worried about the situation with the rebels. We're talking about the King dynasty and the local Korean government at that time, which ends up resulting in the Korean government asking from the last King dynasty for military assistance. And the military assistance they ended up getting was something along the lines of 2,700 soldiers. So the King dynasty sends 2,700 soldiers, but this actually alienates the King dynasty from Japan because they thought this action was a violation of the Convention of Tientsin. So as a result, the Japanese start to ramp up their presence in the region. Now, Japan increased its presence in the country, and they actually start to create the conditions for negotiations between the northern and the southern Jiab groups, and with a force of up to 200K, depending on the source. They eventually do end up executing the rebels who had been rebelling to try to achieve Korean independence at that time. They were executed via hanging. There were firing squads, and there were even reports of people being drowned in rivers who would not cooperate with being hung and things of that sort. And with the level of violence that just kind of is being perpetrated against the Korean people, I do want to go ahead and issue a a trigger warning, because it does get to be quite brutal. So the Treaty of Shimonoseki Sekai grants Korean independence in 1895, and this is achieved after the aforementioned break in relations with the Chinese and Japanese end up leading to the first war between these two countries. Now, what ends up happening as a result of this treaty, among other things, is Korea's independence being formally recognized. So 1904, 1905 is also very important because the Russo-Japanese War is fought over control of Northeast Asia. Russia ends up losing, and Japan ends up annexing Sakhalin. The U.S. and Japan at this time enter a secret agreement. And this agreement states that they're going to formally recognize each other's claims to the Philippines and Korea, respectively. They enter this agreement in secret, and it doesn't end up being something most of the world even knows about until a lot later. So, 1905, Korea becomes a proctorate of Japan, and in 1910, it's officially annexed by Japan. This follows engaged struggle by the Korean righteous armies, who engaged in thousands of skirmishes with Japanese forces. As a matter of fact, between 1907 and 1908, they engaged in something like 2,000 skirmishes with Japanese forces alone, just in that 1 year time period. So these are people who were very much in the spirit of rebellion, trying to push out the Japanese colonizers. So the kind of conditions that existed in the country that had them fighting this hard in the first place were definitely quite brutal. So, for example, you had Japan beginning to restrict all aspects of Korean culture, instituting colonial schools to teach the Japanese language, as well as restricting the allowability of speaking Korean. They were quite literally outlawing speaking Korean in certain regions of the country and of the region and of the land. Now, imperial Japanese institutions taught that Korean was a lesser developed variant of Japanese, further stigmatizing the very act of simply being Korean. So they're very much getting into race science. Korean is a lesser development of the evolution toward being Japanese type rhetoric. These are the kinds of things being propagandized into the Korean people's heads. These are the kind of things being taught to them by the colonizer. And it is not at all surprising if you're familiar with the way colonizers talk at all. If you read Fanon talks in depth about just one of the strategies being that they strip away at your very identity by trying to wither away at your perception of self. So these are the kinds of things that the Korean people are dealing with. So they're dealing with that propaganda. And Japan begins partitioning the land, and they rewrite laws to turn Korean peasants into tenant farmers under Japanese landlord rule. Now, Koreans are forced to portion out food to the square inch of each plot that they're working on. So Japanese landlords, they monopolize the cotton and the rice and divvy that up to the Japanese imperial ruling class, without anything hardly left over for the Korean workers. And so the Korean peasants, the Korean workers, are forced to survive on barley and millet, and also being denied access to their own fisheries that they built up for themselves. So that's another thing they're dealing with. Now, peaceful protests break out. People are understandably rebelling against these conditions. People are saying, Korea should belong to the Koreans. Korean resources should be in the hands of Koreans. The sort of thing that any self-determined colonized people would eventually start to make demands for. But of course, that's not how it ended up playing out in reality, because when those peaceful protests were taken off, Imperial Japan, along with its British and U.S. assistance ended up slaughtering about 7,500 Koreans in peaceful protest in what became to known as the March 1st protest, the March 1st incident. So more examples of Japanese brutality include 6,000 Korean and Japanese socialists being killed after the Great Kanto earthquake, supposedly in response to rumors about a Korean conspiracy. Koreans being forcefully conscripted into the Japanese army in 1944. And this accompanies the 5 million conscripted Koreans forced to labor over Japanese Pacific holdings in the war. And in 1939, Koreans were even forced to change their names to Japanese names. 200,000 are, and this is a trigger warning for sexual assault references, are coerced into relationships with Japanese colonizers and raped by Japanese colonizers. So these are the very real conditions that the colonized Korean comrades are being forced to for 35 years, from 1910 until 1945. Now, we can talk a little bit about, in this period now, the 1945 period, what the logic going on between the Soviets and the Americans are. But to understand and I didn't get to include it in the PowerPoint, there's like 90% of my research results didn't even end up in the PowerPoint, to be honest with y'all. That's how much stuff that there was to uncover when trying to learn about the history of this stuff. But so one of the key things that ended up being a factor in why the Soviets and the Americans had interest in Korea was that Japan, that had its own rich textile industry, was actually outsourcing that labor to Korea, and oftentimes conscripting them to do that labor for free. And as such, even though Korea was a colonized country, for the times that this colonization is happening in, it actually had a very industrialized country because of the outsourcing that Imperial Japan was doing of its textile industry. So the Soviets and the Americans come along and they see this well-developed textile industry, and they say to themselves, okay, well, for different reasons, of course, we have interest in having a relationship with a country that has such well-developed textile industry. Now, with the Americans, it's possibly even more nefarious than that, because not only do they end up wanting to have some kind of control in the region, they're actually considering putting Japan back in place after Korea manages to gain its independence from Japan in 1945, because they're thinking if they can form a relationship with Japan and have Japan reestablish its rule and dominance in the Koreas, then they can by proxy have access to all of Korean industry, not just the textile industry. So this is a consideration of the Americans at the time, and it's very important to consider that they did not do the occupation in the Korean War just come to the cause of of anti-communism, rather, which is obviously a factor, but they were also looking to help advance Japan's interest, because they had interest in having a proxy in the region that wasn't any kind of Korean influence at all. So this is the rationale going on with the Americans. Now the Soviets do end up helping in Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula, and they made the U.S. feel pressure to try and stop Soviet influence throughout the entire region. Of course, communist containment from the U.S. is part of their logic for why they're wanting to intervene in the region. Just like we said, Japan had outsourced much of its industrial labor to Korea, and the USSR and the United States saw an opportunity to tap into the Korean labor force in order to develop their own productive forces. Now, the U.S., like we were saying, also thought that it could be possible to reestablish Japanese rule in the region, and as such, rule Korea through proxy in order to have access to the vast textile industry Japan outsourced and forced Korea to develop. So we can see that it's the logic of imperialism that causes U.S. intervention in the country, as well as the preemptive response to protect interest in Korea by the Soviet Union. So that's what's happening at this time. Now, when you want to talk about causes of the Korean War, it's these things. It's U.S. bisection of the Korean Peninsula. It's the Japanese surrender to the USSR that opens up the opportunism from both the USSR and the USA. And the U.S. even responded to the indigenous government, which was the Korean People's Republic headquartered at Seoul, with an occupation government that it installs. As a matter of fact, when this occupation government gets installed, and they start trying to outlaw. They just started putting anti-socialism on the books. They start rounding up socialist leaders. They start outlawing socialism. They start justifying this behavior by saying stuff along the line. Like, I was finding quotes that said that, socialism is actually an anti-Korean program, and such as to keep the Korean people safe, we must necessarily weed out socialism. These are the kinds of things being said by the U.S. at the time and by its puppets in the South, building to the Korean War. So Korea gets its independence in 1945 after World War II from Japan. Kim Il-sung and his supporters organized a socialist government in 1945 in Seoul called the People's Republic of Korea. Now, Korea at this time, mind you, is still just one Korea. So he sets up with his supporters the People's Republic of Korea. He tries to push support for an all-Korea election in August 1950. And he even proposes a consultative conference that would have taken place in June, but the fascist Sigmund Rhee rejects that proposal. Now, a person called Kenneth C. Royal and John Muccio theorized with Sigmund Rhee that people from the northern region of Korea were demoralized and would switch sides if civil war were to break out. So, and definitely that's 5 years apart, but you can already see that the wheels of imperialism are already turning toward trying to take advantage of the unrest. The Korea had undergone a very brutal process of colonization for 35 years at the hands of Japan, and this was very much obviously still fresh in the memory of the Korean people. This is the logic, and they're trying to take advantage of this very situation that they themselves created in the first place. So yeah, they're very much saying, like, let's just start war, and people will defect to our side in order to try to end it quickly, because they're already fatigued from the colonial situation that had been forced upon the Korean people to that time. So the UN recognized the South, and that stipulated the legitimate rule of the South over the entire peninsula as far as the South was concerned. And it's important to note that the conflict itself, because there have been skirmishes up to this point, is still a civil war, but a mostly contained civil war up until American influence, as again, Korea had been one nation for 1,000 years to that point. So Soviet occupation of the North and U.S. occupation of the South did end up making a military clash inevitable. So Soviets provided bomber planes, medical supplies, and food aid to the DPRK to prepare for what they perceived as an inevitable conflict, and their cynicism unfortunately ended up proving correct. So the Soviet Union's trying to do what it can to avoid providing boots on the ground, so to speak, but it's definitely trying to aid the North and the People's Republic of Korea in as many material ways as it can. It's trying to feed people. It's trying to make sure people are keeping healthy, that sort of thing. But as you're about to see, the war ends up getting pretty brutal. So the war takes off on June 25th, 1950. And to say that this, comrades, was a genocide is an understatement. They dropped 635,000 tons of bombs and other explosives on the DPRK on the north, including almost 33 tons of napalm. For those who have no concept of tons, that's about 66 million tons of napalm dropped on the DPRK. To put this in greater context and to understand how brutal it was, the U.S. dropped 503,000 tons of bombs in the entirety of its Pacific campaign during World War II. 20% of the DPRK's population was killed off as a result of the brutality of the Korean War. And there were all kinds of images that I ended up electing not to show y'all because I really didn't know what the consequence of showing some of those images would be. But there were more cities in the DPRK at the hands of the U.S. than there were in Japan and Germany. Sigmund Rhee rounded up communists from both the North and the South under guise of re-education. And you can start to see like how they end up projecting anti-communist actions that they definitely engaged in onto us and accusing us of doing the very same kind of shit that they were definitely doing. So they justified this method by claiming it was alternative to execution. Now, communist sympathizers were also rounded up to fill out the ranks of the Bodo League, and this was known well as the National Bodo League. Now, with this, they executed something along the lines of 100,000 communist and communist sympathizers. They were hung, they were tortured, and there was one story where a communist had a nail put through one of their eyes and like out of the back of their head that I ended up reading about in order to try to get them to give up on their Korean comrades that were in hiding. They had some communists that they were trying to weed out, and this person who they put the nail through the eye and out the back of and tried to put it through the back of their head would not relent on that, and so that's how they ended up torturing that person. The Korean War, as I said, was nothing short of a genocide. They killed 20 million people. So when we talk about the DPR, not 20 million people, 20% of the Korean people. So when we talk about what's going on in North Korea, when we talk about the conditions to get today, when we talk about it limits access to information and it's hard to know what's going on in the country. We have to really wrestle, comrades, with the very real situation that the country is dealing with. They like I said, they dropped 66 million pounds of napalm on the country. You know, they leveled more bombs and they leveled more buildings than they did in Japan and Germany. They the colonizing imperial Japanese coerced and raped 200,000 women. People were forced into labor, laboring for these people, and then not even able to eat off of their labor. This is the situation that's still very fresh in the minds of our Korean comrades. And so no matter what's your thoughts on North Korea, or the DPRK rather, might be, you have to understand what kind of conditions they're trying to avoid ever having to go back to, should the logic of imperialism ever play out in that country again. So these are the things they're trying to avoid, and this is why I wanted to talk with y'all tonight about just the lead up to the Korean War, how brutal it was, and just how much the Koreans have sacrificed so far, or not even sacrificed, had taken away from them just for them to be able to continue to exist to this day. So that wraps up the PowerPoint point of the presentation. we're gonna get into life after the Korean War. That itself is about a little under 70 years of history to talk to y'all about. I just wanted to set the picture for what's on the minds of the Korean people in terms of imperialism and the colonial situation that was forced on it. And I want every person in this server to just know what the hell they're talking about when they try to talk about so-called brutality, of Korea, which not only is typically unverifiable, but often projection when you look at the very real brutality forced upon that country, and yet this is a country very much still trying to hang on, and survive under the conditions forced upon it by imperialism. The imperialists count it as their greatest failure, or one of their greatest failures at all, that Korea, that the DPRK has somehow even managed to continue to exist. That's what they're pissed about. Just about any other country subjected to the conditions that happen to be forced upon the DPRK, they wouldn't be here anymore, comrades. But the DPRK has managed to persist, and the colonizers are mad as hell about it, and they're gonna die mad about it. And that's the reality of what the fuck we did to those people. We wiped out a fifth of the population. This country did, along with its British and French and other colonial allies. They coerced and abused those 200,000 women. They pillaged the land. They tried to do quite literally a cultural genocide and assimilate into their culture every Korean person into Japanese culture. They straight up did Aryan race science on Koreans, or propagandized that into them, before Hitler had ever even read anything about race science. So this is that's the reality of the situation that the North Koreans don't want to get back into. And anybody who can know that and not have any sympathy at all for that country is a damn colonizer, and they're certainly no comrade of ours. So the North and they were one country for 1,000 years, an empire even. Actually, they weren't even known as Korea for a good amount of their time. It's not even necessarily a accurate thing to say that the South and the North are against each other. The South and both the South and the North consider themselves to be the one true recognized government, or the one true legitimate government, for all of Korea. Both of these people, both of these countries still operate from the framework today, particularly in the case of the North, that Korean people are one people. That is the logic of colonialism and imperialism that divided them up, not the will of Koreans. And if you talk to Koreans, oftentimes, if you have any Korean friends or Korean comrades in your life, they oftentimes talk about wanting consolidation and solidarity with the North, but then in a very liberal way talk about communism as being why there can't be solidarity, and that anti-communism is the only way to struggle to eventually bring the North and the South back together. But what's happening to the North and the South in terms of the people that live there is not even anything close to the democratic will of the Korean people, as much as it is a forced upon logic of colonialism and imperialism by these settlers, these European settlers, the Japanese imperialists, and just a long history of brutality in the region that necessarily resulted in present day relations. So that's the reality of it all. I'm not sure if this will be covered in the next presentation, but what was the organization of the North like when the Soviets got there? I've heard about the people's communities that were across Korea at the time, but I don't know their specific structure or histories. So that's a good question, Sudowoodo. So the structure of government at this time is very much still being worked out because they're in a very real way trying to both resist anti-socialist pressure that's coming from the U.S. and from remnants of imperial Japan, and at the same time trying to figure out a way to utilize the productive forces that have been developed been developed by the Korean people for the benefit of Japan to their benefit. So at that time, they're doing things like organizing workers' co-ops. They're trying to take anybody who has any sort of military experience and get them organized around the country, dividing them up to protect against any kind of would-be imperialist force coming into the country. So they're in a very real way heavily trying to fortify their borders. They're trying to particularly keep Japanese presence out. It was the case that for a pretty long time, any Japanese person who was caught, in Korea, their life was very much in danger as a result of the logic of imperialism. They're doing things like trying to democratically decide how food will be divvied up, since a lot of the food, especially the rice, had been kept out of the hands of Korean people. So now they're trying to figure out how to distribute that in a way that they find efficient, and at the same time trying to work with different socialist and liberal groups that are coming from the South in order to try to make sure that the country doesn't end up having happen what does happen to it, and end up getting partitioned. So they're having a very hard time dealing with the real material reality on the ground as a result of having just got the colonial boot off of their neck. And so that's kind of what's going on in the country when the Soviets occupied. I thought China was the only one where Japan went to, and Gian, the Imperial Japan does not get enough due for just how much terror it reaped upon the world. If you are so inclined, just go read the testimonies and the stories of the so-called comfort women, from the Koreas, and you'll know depravity. But I'll offer you a warning, my friend. It's not anything that you should do if you are not prepared to deal with some of the most brutal shit that you ever read about in your life. Like, it's about the most awful shit that you have ever read, and I purposely chose not to include the grotesque details in this presentation because that's not what we're about here in Red Theory. So Sudawoodle says they call the Korean War the forgotten war in America because if any citizen actually looked at what we did to the Koreans, they would be forced to acknowledge our government's unabashed brutality. Yeah, that's exactly it, Sudawoodle. Rather than starting off with present day Korea, I wanted to start off with the history that led up to the Korean War in the first place, so that people can understand what's on the minds of the Korean people when they support their government today, what's on the minds of the government when people are trying to analyze why they make the decisions they make. Everything that the DPRK does today is a perfectly logical response to what has happened to it historically, especially with even recent history since the end of the Korean War, with some of the brutality of the floods and the collapse of the USSR and the famines that plagued the region through the 90s as a result of these different environmental and economic factors. It's extremely important to contextualize this so that we don't dehumanize these people when the U.S. tries to spread its propaganda, and so that we end up being able to resist when they try to say, totalitarian this, totalitarian that, when actuality, everything that they do makes total sense for what it is that they have been through, and that Americans are allowed into the country at all at this point, despite everything that it's been put through by America and by Japan, kind of shows that there is a will in the country to try to engage with world geopolitics, but they are purposely isolated off during the Jimmy Carter administration. Jimmy Carter entertained the idea of opening up a direct personal relationship with the DPRK, and his advisors talked him into saying, like, what was the line? There is no purpose to having a relationship with the DPRK. And since then, the policy has been to keep tabs on the DPRK through a proxy relationship with China. That's kind of been the line on it since then. So it's very revealing when you think about how they talk about people and what kind of conditions they imposed upon them when they get into the bullshit that they talk today about these people's countries. They don't even tell you about the British Korea and the British school syllabus. Of course not. So could I ask, what was Kim Il-sung's role in these early days of the war? I know he was a consistent independence fighter, even back during Japanese colonization, but what was his role pre-the war, and how did he come to be a big leader in the movement? You know, there are conflicting sources about that, because from what I've read, Kim Il-sung was actually a member of the CPC, and it actually seems to be the case that his Chinese was better than his Korean in terms of his ability to speak language, but there are very real material reasons for that. The Japanese were quite literally outlawing Korean in regions of the country during the time Kim Il-sung would have been growing up. And so, you know, when we talk about that, people often try to describe him as being out of touch with his Korean roots and having no relationship to Korea itself, and then they'll try to point to his not having perfect Korean as opposed to being able to speak Mandarin. But it's like, well, when you are literally being told that you have to take a Japanese name, and when you're being told that your language is being, suppressed from you in terms of your ability to speak it, and certainly your ability to learn it, what exactly is supposed to end up being the material reality when it comes to your relationship with your language? It might very well be the case that you can't speak it. So and I need to read more into it. I didn't focus as much on that part of it, as I was just wanting to more so get into the DPRK as a whole and not too much focus on great man or any one person. But it's definitely suggested that he was put there because he spoke Mandarin, that he was convenient to the Soviets because he had a relationship with them, and it's theorized that he was just a convenient person for them to place in power and support, because as a person who struggled speaking Korean, he would necessarily need a lot of help from the Soviets, both materially and coming up with strategies. So his role was something of, from some people's point of view, and like I said, I don't know enough to have come down with my own line on it, but according to some people, his role was just something along the lines of a convenient Soviet, for lack of a better word, puppet. But you also have to know that very rhetoric itself, you can see how that would necessarily be a favorable line for anti-communists to take, as you can just get into the logic of like, oh, look at these communists, propping up people who don't even speak good Korean in Korea in order to spread their filthy communist agenda and nonsense. So, it's something worth doing an investigation on, to see how much truth there is to the fact that his lack of a supposed relationship to Korea, especially compared to some of the people who are in a more long-term way engaged in an anti-Japanese struggle, made him a convenient friend to the Soviet Union. But I also kind of suspect that it's not anywhere near as simple as that, because even just saying it out loud, even though I'm trying to be as honest with you as I can about this supposed origin story for him, it just sounds like there's more to the story than that. So let's investigate it and see in the future if there's more to it. The Chinese helped them win and probably didn't want too much direct conflict with the U.S. beyond what was necessary to set up a buffer. Any idea what the Soviet intervention in Korea looked like? I don't know anything about Soviet foreign policy. Like, were they asked to enter Korea, or was it some type of intervention? So it's definitely the case that the North asked for some assistance from the Soviets, and like I said earlier in the presentation, they provided bombs, they provided food aid, they provided medical supplies, that sort of thing. But they, to the extent they did, would have provided very minimal soldiers to the Koreans. But it was definitely the case that Koreans were wary of any occupation in their country at that time. So the Soviet wary rather of providing manpower, but they provided a pretty overwhelming amount of material support. That's the materialist answer to that question anyways. I think that's all the questions that I can find in the chat. If I find more questions, I'll get them answered for next week's presentation for y'all. But it was good doing this presentation for y'all. It was learning about the brutality of the Korean War and even everything that happened, under Japanese colonization and imperialist and to Korea at the hands of Imperial Japan was a pretty depressing thing. But I think if we're going to be materialist and we're going to try to talk about modern countries and their prospects for helping build world socialism, that is necessary to understand what the perspectives of those countries would be and to understand the perspectives of the DPRK. You cannot divorce yourself from learning about what the reality of the Korean War happened to be. We're going to wrap up now. Thank you guys for being here. Solidarity comrades, I love y'all. Y'all know I love y'all. Solidarity. And I'll see you guys next Monday and throughout the week. Take care.